The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Window World of Western Mass, a local family-owned and operated complete exterior remodeling business offering windows, siding, gutters, and more. windowworldofwesternma.com. The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Ski Sundown in nearby New Hartford, Connecticut, offering night skiing until 10 on 16 groomed and lighted trails. Ticket and rental information at skisundown.com. Winter made better.
Welcome to the Fabulous 413. I'm Khalees Smith.
I'm Monty Belmonte. Later in the show, sorry for all you Deep Impact fans out there, but asteroid YR4 has been reclassified, and Mr. Universe, Professor Salman Hamid, will talk to us about why its shift on the Torino scale is important.
We'll also hear about Reparations Day, which is already a holiday, it turns out, and Professor Ousmane Power-Greene will tell us more about it and how it's a call to action.
We'll also check in with NEPM's Karen Brown, who's just wrapped a two-part series looking at the shortage of primary care doctors in the area.
But first, we've all been hearing about federal cuts for the past month, but it may be hard to see how those cuts are having very real consequences.
So let's head up to Ashfield, where those consequences have just become very real.
While we are constantly hearing national headlines about the work of the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, unless you or someone you know is a federal employee, those slash-and-burn, cost-cutting measures may, at the moment, still seem somewhat abstract.
But last Friday afternoon, a friend of mine, I will shout out Amber Baker Corby, sent me a link to a Facebook post from one Abby Ferla of Foxtrot Farm in Ashfield. The post read, in part, "Yesterday we and hundreds of other small farms in the Northeast were informed that we would not be getting grant funding that had already been allocated by Congress for climate-smart practices and funding. Many of us were counting on this money for the next 4 seasons. We personally were planning on $35,000 for this coming year."
The post continues, these practices have been targeted by the current administration as Green New Deal social engineering. We are joined by the author of the post, the farm manager for Foxtrot Farm in Ashfield, Abby Ferla. Thanks for joining us, Abby.
Hi, you all. So grateful to be here. I'm a big fan.
We're big fans of farmers like you.
In general, because without farms, we all starve because no one has built a replicator yet.
Oh, that would be so cool to go that Star Trek route, but until then, we can't. Green New Deal social engineering. Tell us about how you were informed that your grant that you were counting on would no longer be available to you.
I'll take a quick step back and talk about the way that federal funding for farms works.
Okay.
The USDA gets about 3% of the federal budget. Most of that goes to SNAP food assistance, and then it goes to all kinds of other programs, and about 3% of it goes to this program called the NRCS, which was created after the Dust Bowl to prevent another Dust Bowl from happening. The NRCS, which is the National Resource Conservation Service, does this work of reimbursing farmers for adopting practices that may be less profitable in the short term, but that conserve soil, protect waterways, and in general make our built and natural environment around us a safer place to live. So it's protecting our natural resources that we all share, and in order to do that, farmers enter contracts. This funding replicates NRCS practices, but it was funded by the Inflation Reduction Act, part of the Climate Smart Commodities Program, which is another USDA program, but the extra funding here came from the Inflation Reduction Act, which is where the Green New Deal climate, what do they call it? Green New Deal social engineering comes in. We don't have a Green New Deal in this country, but to the extent that some Green New Deal practices were adopted, they were done so through the Inflation Reduction Act. This funding in particular was to reimburse small farmers for adopting these climate smart practices. And I think that wherever you stand on the scientific consensus around climate change, we can all agree that natural disasters are increasing and they're becoming more intense. And so climate smart practices are really just a way of saying weather resilient practices. So they're things that make farms more resilient to floods, to droughts, to wind events. On our farm in Ashfield, where we grow 4 acres of elderberry and then about 3 acres of botanical herbs and garlic, And then we have some experimental fruit and nut trees. The funding was going to help us put in more perennial fruit and nut trees to help stop erosion in our fields and also create microclimates to grow different plants inside of. So this is a really cool practice. It sequesters carbon. In the long term, as these fruit and nut trees mature, they can add value and profit to a farm enterprise. But, often planting perennials is really expensive and it takes a long time to get a return on it. So the federal government will sometimes be willing to enter a contract with farmers to reimburse them for the cost of those shrubs. We also were going to get fencing to put around these shrubs.
I'm assuming that this disproportionately affects small farms as opposed to bigger agriculture out west. And also, again, small note, didn't the Dust Bowl happen in the heart of red state territory?
Yes, it totally did. You're so right. And the NRCS, for the most part, actually serves large farms in the Midwest. So that 3% of the 3% of the federal budget, I would say probably 99% of that goes to really large farms who are also getting, subsidies and crop insurance payouts. Small farms get the tiniest percentage of federal funding. And this specific funding in the Inflation Reduction Act was targeted towards small producers. So that's disproportionately the kind of producers that we have in the Northeast. So I think Northeast farmers are getting hit especially hard from this particular decision.
And we've spoken with Congressman McGovern many times about the renegotiations of the Farm Bill and how the lion's share of all of that text is dealing with these huge farms in the breadbasket, and many of our Northeast farms and smaller farms are overlooked. And we're talking to one of the farmers from one of those smaller farms, Abby Ferla from Foxtrot Farm in Ashfield, who was just notified last week that $35,000 that was part of a contract with the federal government through the Climate Smart Practices funding will be cut thanks to DOGE. We keep mentioning that it would be cut because of Green New Deal social engineering. Where did that phrase come from, and how were you notified about the breaking of this contract?
Well, I added that terminology into the Facebook post because my goal was, people think government is this large, nefarious thing over there. And they think that when people talk about Marxist gender ideology or Green New Deal social engineering, that phrase comes from the executive order to freeze federal funding. Mm-hmm. So the initial freeze of all federal funding, they said that they were doing this to root out Green New Deal social engineering.
And your post does go on to talk about other issues that have been in the news because of DOGE and these sweeping cuts. But how were you notified that these cuts were coming through? And I know I have started to hear from other farms. There's a great piece in the Montague Reporter newspaper about the farm in Montague. They keep bees and how they're, again, another climatological farming, taking farming to the next phase.
That have been helping other people start apiaries all over Western Mass.
That's also being cut. So how were you notified by the feds that this was going to no longer be available to you?
So this is going to be another piece about the bureaucracy of federal funding, but the Climate Smart Commodities Grant has sub-grantees. And so the sub-grantee that is administering the grant for us is the Pennsylvania Association of Sustainable Agriculture. Mm-hmm. They sent out an email to everyone on Thursday night saying that because certain practices, these climate smart practices I've been talking about, require a specific kind of environmental review, and DOGE had cut the contract with the only third-party contractor in the country that does these environmental reviews for them, that none of these practices could be reimbursed anymore. And they did encourage us to contact the USDA, to contact our representatives to try to fight this, but for the time being, those funds will not be available. Part of what's happening here is that nobody can get a hold of anyone at the USDA, and we don't know if it's because they're in total chaos or if the person whose contact information you have is fired. Right. So I heard, people responded to my post from all over the country, and I heard from several people who were fired NRCS workers saying, thank you for standing up. I lost my job last week. Generally, it's chaos. It's just farmers do not know if they will get reimbursed for contracts they already had. They don't know if if grants that are currently open will actually be funded. It's a very hard environment to budget and to do business in.
We're speaking with farmer Abby Ferla from Foxtrot Farm in Ashfield, who was just notified last week that they would be losing $35,000 in a federal grant for climate-smart practices. And as you mentioned, your post did gain a lot of attention, over 5,000 interactions, hundreds and hundreds of comments, some of which were critical, saying, why should the federal government be subsidizing a tiny, as they were calling it, hobby farm? You had some interesting retorts.
Well, my favorite thing to do to respond to those people was just to drop a link into my comment response that showed the amount of subsidies that top 100 companies get from the United States, which is in the billions of dollars.
Some companies like what?
Boeing is number one. Mm-hmm. They have about $18 billion in loans and subsidies and grants from the federal government. But, notably, Tesla has $2 billion or $2.7 billion, I think. I always like to point out that the vast majority of farm funding in this country goes towards really large-scale industrial corporate farms. And those farmers don't do it by themselves either. People were saying, if you can't be profitable, you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. You shouldn't be asking for a government handout. And what gets obscured there is that none of the so-called profitable businesses are doing it by themselves either. Mm-hmm. Everybody gets business assistance in some way or another for the most part. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We pay into our shared tax system because we have systems of mutual support for each other. And in the case of grants for farmers, the federal government is hoping that what they're doing is investing in people who can create rural jobs, who can, protect natural resources, and who can secure our food supply. So these big farms in the Midwest, they farm with really extractive processes to the extent that they can turn a profit. They're able to do it because they extract from the land, they pay undocumented people under the table below minimum wage, and they do it in ways that pollute our watersheds. So I don't see anything wrong with supporting farms in small rural areas and other places in the country that create jobs, that farm in ways that might survive climate change, and, that do a lot of benefit to our local rural economies.
Somebody was making an argument to me last night about this shift being that of putting more of the onus back on states and sort of a states' rights thing coming to the fore. Do you see any of the grant that you would have gotten through the federal government? Are there avenues for you to make up any of that through the state?
Yeah, that's it's a great point. And we're really lucky in Massachusetts that MDAR, that's our Mass Department of Agricultural Resources,
and a planet near the Mustafar system, I always like to say. Sounds like a Star Wars planet.
MDAR is really supportive of small farmers and climate resilient practices. They've been really putting a lot of money in building a resilient local food system. And you can tell that they're trying to build food security in the Commonwealth and in New England. So there is state funding that is available for certain kinds of things. But that kind of grant funding is never guaranteed. And, the hundreds of farmers across the Northeast who were prepared to get the funding this year had already put that into their budgets. They'd, already bought supplies. We'd hired people. I think I'm probably going to have to reduce my crew by, at least half a person this year because we just don't have the money to do the work in April like we thought we would.
And so you will have to make these real-time adjustments. Is that going to be the only impact, you think, with the loss of this $35,000 from this federal grant? More than half a person going to be cut, or is this the only implications for your farm, Foxtrot Farm, in Ashfield, Abby?
I mean, I'm also probably going to have to give myself a pay cut. There are other ways that I get federal funding that are part of the money that I pay myself to do this. I mentor farmers who are transitioning to organic practices. We get cost share reimbursement on our organic certification fees. And, in a climate where you don't know if any of your contracts are going to be respected, I'm just preparing to potentially pay myself a little bit less this year and try to find other avenues for that. But more to the point, we're not going to be able to put up a fence around our row crops this year, which was going to allow me to be able to grow more food for our Pick Your Own members in case the food system gets less secure. We just cannot grow kale with the deer pressure around our fields.
I've heard of peer pressure, but deer pressure,
Look,
that's new to me.
Deer pressure is real, so is groundhog pressure.
They're trying to get you to
Those are
smoke
the animals
kale.
that eat my kale.
Yeah.
The forest creatures love the brassicas.
I'm hopeful that we'll be able to find other ways to finance these goals. But, currently we have 4 acres of elderberry, and we just launched a line of elderberry syrups that's doing really well. One of the goals with this funding was to plant out more elderberry shrubs in other parts of the farm and to plant out other small fruit and nut crops that could actually complement that line. We'll have to find other ways to finance that, and we'll also have to find other ways to fence, which, is a very expensive thing to put in. It's like $30,000 to put in a deer fence around 3 acres. So we'll have to push those plans back. We also had been hoping to use some of the funding to start putting in chestnuts, which are a really long investment, but in 20 years, they could bring a lot of food security to the region. And with the increase in instability and growing conditions, we're looking to just invest as much as possible in plants that can weather drought years like we had in 2023 or in 2024 and flood years like we had in 2023. Our goal is just to make sure that there's food in the future. I'm going to find ways to make that happen because we have to have food in the future, but the timeline is going to have to change.
Abby Ferla, who is the farmer from Foxtrot Farm, who last week posted on social media about the canceling of a government contract at the hands of the Department of Government Efficiency that will cost this small farm in Ashfield $35,000 over the next 4 seasons. Best of luck to you through all this, Abby, and thanks for telling your story here and on social media.
Thank you all for having me on. I really appreciate it.
You can find out more about Foxtrot Farm and how they're coping at foxtrotfarm.com. Thanks again to Abby Ferla for making time for us.
We'll learn about how giving reparations a holiday can maybe help them to become more real in the future with Professor Ousmane Power-Greene, and we'll hear about the PCP shortage with NEPM's Karen Brown.
But that will all be after we hear a tribute to a beloved Amherst College astronomer and learn why an asteroid discovered last year is not actually going to hit the Earth and kill us all. Mr. Universe Salman Hamid is up next.
You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Northeast Solar, offering solar options, energy security, and solutions for the local community. Learn more at northeast-solar.com.
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
Time once again for some kitchen table astronomy at the Amherst Kitchen Table of Hampshire College and Kynott Studios astronomer Dr. Salman Hamid. We are going to remember an astronomer from here in the Fabulous 413 who's passed.
Yeah, I want to mention the passing of George Greenstein. Professor George Greenstein, he was a Sidney Dillon Professor of Astronomy at Amherst College. He retired from Amherst College in 2012, but he was still active. He actually was on the hiring committee. When I came here as a postdoc, as a 5-college astronomy department postdoc, and my position was split between Smith and UMass, but he was one of the people who interviewed me, along with Professor Susan Edwards at Smith College. And right from the beginning, if you say something that's intrigued him, he would sort of close his eyes and then think about it. And then there would be a smile on his face, and he would follow up with something really thoughtful, interesting. And for me, one of the things that I had to do when I came here was to develop a class on astronomy and public policy. Mm-hmm. This was a new type of class, and I think George Greenstein was the people who thought about this class, along with Professor Susan Edwards. And we had to meet in my first semester. We would meet once a week at Panda East in downtown Amherst.
I love that, yeah.
The two of them would be there. They're both sort of like senior professors, and I was freshly minted PhD. So to me, every time it looked like that it's going to be a thesis exam. But it was just so much fun because the conversation was always interesting, and it's the thoughtfulness. I always wanted to, especially for George Greenstein, say something where he would close his eyes, think about it, smile, and then say, well, that's a good point, or something. And he was intellectually, he was always pushing the boundaries, not just from astronomy, in other fields as well. He actually wrote multiple popular astronomy books, but one of the books he wrote back in the early 80s called Frozen Star, and it was about black holes, pulsars, and other types of strange objects. And I had actually read that before I came to this area in 2001, and he was a great, thoughtful writer, but he was also a photographer. He had great exhibitions, actually great photographs and exhibitions in New York. I also remember him talking about science and religion. I mean, he was one of those people really thinking about it. He was an atheist. At one point, I think there was a seminar on science and religion at UMass, and we were on the same table. His question was, and I still remember, I think this was back in 2003 or 4, and he says, well, I just want to know why this sack of atoms. Can you just think about these questions? I mean, just why?
When a sack of atoms meaning a human being?
Oh, meaning a human being, yes. And when you are talking to him, you always knew he was thinking about the question that you are asking. And you could also see that he's not presuming the answer. He actually is going to sort through the thing that you have brought up. You would run into him in downtown Amherst, and that's why always there will be an interesting conversation, because he was curious in what you have to say. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, he's a model, at least for me, because he remained active in these questions, always smiling, but also intellectually engaged and always interested in questions. And so it's sad, like, he passed away a couple of days ago, but a genuinely pleasure to know him.
Remembering Amherst College astronomer George Greenstein, who has returned to stardust. We are all going to return to stardust at some point. Are we going to return to stardust when an asteroid comes and hits this planet? That's the other big astronomy story, Dr. Salman Hamid, Mr. Universe. Everybody's worried about this potential threat of an asteroid impact. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. Where are we at with this potential asteroid that could turn us all into stardust?
Okay, so asteroid 2024 YR4. That is the name, and it was discovered a couple of days after Christmas. It's a small asteroid. We don't exactly know its size, but it's around 50 meters or around 150 feet. Size of Olympic-sized swimming pool. Okay, so this is not something that's, if it hits the Earth, that it's going to destroy the planet. It's not going to be like the dinosaur extinction one. It's going to be about what they call a city killer asteroid. Mm-hmm. This particular asteroid is in an orbit that takes it close to the asteroid belt, which is farther away than Mars. I think its closest encounter was on Christmas, December 25th. And then the next one is going to be December 17th of 2028. Mm-hmm. That is not a threat.
Okay.
But the initial calculation suggested that on December 22nd, 2032, not that far away, the idea was that, well, it may come close enough that the odds initially, when astronomers calculated, were like about 1% or so, 1.2%. Then it increased
1.2% that it would hit us.
That it would hit us.
Yeah.
That's pretty high, by the way.
Yeah.
And then it went to 2%, and then it went to 3%.
Right.
And that becomes a little bit serious when it goes to 3%. However, you need more observations to really finesse the orbit that we know of. And even if there is a little bit of change, it would miss it.
Right.
And as you can imagine, when it was found that, well, it has a couple of % chance, there were a lot of telescopes, a lot of observations that started to look for, well, what is its orbit is going to be? And I just checked, actually, this morning, what are its chances? And it turns out no problem at all.
Really?
Now, the chances had actually gone to pretty much zero.
So why don't you hear that news story? I heard it when it went up to 3%, but when it goes back down to zero, nobody's like, it's not as, if it bleeds, it leads kind of newspaper headline if the asteroid's not going to hit us.
That's part of the problem, right? But I should mention, astronomers have created a scale. It's called Torino scale. It's based in a city in Italy where there was a conference in early 2000s.
Shroud of Turin.
So the Torino scale was designed so that we can actually figure out how much should we panic when such news come out. So, for example, if there is a really big asteroid, we should panic if it is going to hit us. Right. So just because there is a big asteroid out there and we detect it and there is no chance of hitting us, then the Torino scale is zero.
Right.
No problem. And on the other side, if you have a small piece of rock and the way they defined it was sort of like, smaller than 20 meters, then sure enough, it may hit us, but it's not going to cause any damage. So let's not worry about that either.
So also 0.
For Torino scale, the highest one is, for city scale, it's 8. For regional devastation, it's 9. And for extinction level, it's 10. If those are coming to hit you, the probability is very high. You go to Torino scale of 8, 9, and 10.
Yeah.
So where was this, even at its highest, at 3%?
Which I'm going to start calling the Whamageddon asteroid, because it was discovered on Christmas. It's going to wham or not, cause Armageddon or not, and, the Christmas song by Wham.
Thank you, Monty, for bringing in Wham and George Michael. I think we should call every asteroid a Wham again.
No, but we can name them all after other Wham songs.
Just wake me up, okay? Before the next one comes. This particular one, 2024 YR4, this had a Torino scale of 3. And this has the highest Torino scale given to any asteroid since the Torino scale, we started working on that since...
Which was 20 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the first time that happened that it went that high. So that is what... But do you worry about it? Well, no. Because astronomers also knew that they're going to refine the object, but now it has gone down because of more observations. It looks like it's not going to impact us at all. But that doesn't mean that things don't hit us. This is the kind of asteroid in terms of size, potentially like the Great Meteor Crater in Arizona. It's called Barringer Crater. That was probably, the impact was around 50 to 100 meters across, and it happened about 50,000 years ago. And the crater is about a mile in diameter. So if something like this hits us, can it cause damage? Absolutely. But this one is not. But if I can say, there's a lot of sensationalism that comes with these type of things. And you want to get good information. One of the things that we tell people is look for good resources. Usually, NASA is the best source. And I think this is the first time that has happened, at least to me, because of the kinds of news that we have been hearing in the last month or so. I was like, okay, let's check the NASA website. But there was a doubt in my mind whether the information over there is going to be there or whether the information over there is going to be accurate or not. Never thought in my life that going to NASA site, I would have a little bit of a doubt. I wonder what kind of information they will have, or if there will be information about that. Fortunately, yes, it looks like there it was, but I also double-checked. So this is one of those things, how things change at a practical level, because there is an international asteroid warning network, and which is a UN-mandated network. I went to their website. But one of the reasons was, and I think this is in terms of a habit now we have to do that, is to look for confirmation from... And it gave me a little bit of confidence too. It's like, oh, I'm glad there are other space agencies on it as well. There's a little bit of sadness in there because people who work at NASA are amazing. Of course, science is amazing. And it's not that in 1 month things have changed. But to me, there was this doubt, like, I hope their voices are going, or what they have been working on is going to be on the website, because certain websites just went dark. Anything that mentioned diversity, for example, or any other things, like, again, I say this with deep sadness. because NASA is also considered, in Pakistan and everywhere, by the way, the coolest agency.
Totally.
People
wear the merch.
Exactly. They would have stickers. And I met somebody last week that come from Pakistan. The guy came in and said, oh, astronomy. He said, I have a 10-year-old and he's really into astronomy. And he wrote a letter to NASA. People just write a letter to NASA. Dear NASA, because they think, because of the reputation, because of the respect that people have. And I hope it will still remain, or I hope it will not be devastated the way we think it might. But if the next asteroid is coming in who may actually be hitting us, we do need missions like DART mission that had gone in and hit an asteroid. It was a sort of crashed on it.
To prove we could do it.
To prove we could do it, because if this asteroid, if it turned out that this was coming in to hit us, then we would have needed a mission like DART to go in and kinetically impact it and do that. And for that, you need you need people who can actually do that. And I have to add this, and competency doesn't mean just white people. I think competency means everybody, and diversity is also crucial because you bring in different perspectives. I just have to add that.
It's a good thing to add.
Thank you, Mr. Universe. Wondering why you can't get an appointment with your primary care physician? NEPM's Karen Brown was too, and we'll hear some of the answers she found shortly.
After we look at reparative practices from a more celebratory perspective with Professor Ousmane Power-Greene and learn about Reparations Day.
You're listening to The Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
The fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Ski Sundown in nearby New Hartford, Connecticut, offering night skiing until 10 on 16 groomed and lighted trails. Ticket and rental information at skisundown.com. Winter made better.
Time for our fourth segment of The Power of History. It's our regular monthly segment, month in and month out here on the Fabulous 413, but quadrupling down for Black History Month with Professor of History at Clark University in Worcester from Northampton, Dr. Ousmane Power-Greene.
Yes.
You, in your civilian life, have been very much involved with the Reparations Committee in the city of Northampton where you live. But new-ish to you and new to us
Definitely new to us.
is a day that talks about reparations in the month of February, February 25th.
That's right.
Reparation Day. Tell us about this day, Dr. Ousmane Power-Greene.
Yeah, so first of all, again, thanks for having me on. It's always wonderful to be able to sort of think about Black history in a variety of ways. And one element of Black history that a lot of us aren't as aware of is the long history of reparations. I mean, reparations has been in the media more recently, but the long struggle, the historic struggle for reparations is something that most people aren't aware of. And Reparations Awareness Day, February 25th, has that exact purpose, right? Is to really think about the grassroots movement established by the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. I guess the final NCOBRA is the acronym that most of us know better. Established Reparations Awareness Day in the 90s in order to move the conversation beyond just sort of activists and into more general community celebrations. And as we talked about on the show, all celebrations, whether it's MLK Day or Juneteenth, have a fundamental purpose of bringing people together to think about, the topic or issue, the person, et cetera, but also bring people in to learn about a topic that maybe they don't know as much about. And so Reparations Day is exactly that. African Americans actually have gotten reparations. The thing is, we don't have the federal government yet. Sheila Jackson Lee passed away in 2024. Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts has picked this up in H.R. 40. But one thing that's been happening, I think, in earnest since the early 2000s, is institutions around the nation actually doing reparations work and really beginning a process of repair. And some people may not know what reparations is, but reparations is essentially a movement to think about repair, redress. I'm blanking on the UN's thing now, but it's the purpose is for communities to think about the role slavery and Jim Crow segregation has played in American history and life, and then thinking about those racial harms, ways that institutions, cities, municipalities, organizations can repair, right? And so oftentimes people focus on the sort of idea of financial compensation as reparations, but really reparations is much broader than that. Places like, for example, Georgetown University, which is a university as a part of the early efforts towards reparations, when they, through the work of reparations, began to learn and acknowledge that enslaved people built and were sold to maintain and build these universities, put a reparations provision that allowed descendants of enslaved people who are a part of that to attend Georgetown University for free. And so institutions have been involved in reparations. Municipalities like Evanston, Illinois, has actually more recently, last few years, has actually passed a reparations ordinance for descendants of enslaved people. There's reparations for Japanese Americans who were interned, and also reparations for those that were involved in the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, which has become more prominent when President Joe Biden sort of acknowledged it as a massacre and spoke on that day.
Thanks, Watchmen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, the HBO show Watchmen really brought that to the public awareness in a way that it hadn't before.
Other people were not aware that this was a thing that happened. And Tulsa's honestly the biggest example of that. But that was happening to black towns across the South. That's real. It's that's real.
I met a playwright who was white who grew up in Tulsa and never in the entirety of the Tulsa education system in that city had ever heard that story before, and these are important stories to bring forward. Now we're in an era where we have never had a massive federal reparation, a 40 acres and a mule style proposition to try to bring people who were formerly enslaved up to some sort of sense of economic equity, but where municipalities like Northampton, where you're from, like Amherst, working towards this.
Boston
is this a both and scenario that you think people should, if reparation is something that you think is right, Is this something that should be happening both from a municipal level and aspirationally from a federal level as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so there's a couple ways to think about the possibility of, real significance, broad repair for racialized harms, including, for example, racist covenants that have been placed on homes in places like Northampton, including, specific barriers to employment and opportunities. When we begin to talk about repair, I believe the social movement version, meaning everywhere and, right, from personal families, which documentary films have tried to capture. I know an extraordinary story of a student who received individual reparations. It's an incredible story, which one day maybe I'll be able to tell for all you on the air.
Very interesting.
From an individual donor who actually said, I want to be anonymous, but we're supporting students and $5,000 a semester. So when I think about reparations, I think of the possibility of a mass movement that would force every entity that had, for whatever reason, were involved with, racial harm to think about what is adequate solutions to this. What do we believe could be important for repair? And that's exactly what we're doing in Northampton on a municipal level, advising the mayor and city council about what, in our opinion, are recommendations for ways Northampton can compare. So that's a long way of saying both and. But really, I do think that a federal H.R. 40 always will provide inspiration and potentially, as some scholars have argued, in terms of economic, financial reparations, is the entity that could potentially do it. So both ends.
So bills and movements like H.R. 40, which are currently kind of in the works, what do we feel like the temperature is for them, considering the current administration and the dissolution of DEI initiatives and equal opportunity mandates?
Yeah, I actually think that sometimes when people are waiting for something to happen, we can sort of get complacent or we can be distracted by other pressing social issues. When a prominent person, maybe the most, one of the most prominent people, the president, begins to go directly at reforms that people feel like have been institutionalized, like, for example, DEI in many companies and businesses, when that becomes attacked and people feel threatened, I actually think it leads to more momentum. I think this moment is an important moment for people to really hunker down and say, like, okay, these are the reasons why initiatives that are around Black History Month, DEI initiatives are important. It's what we value. And so I think this is an important moment for that.
Many of the people who I don't want to believe are bad people that are listening to what the Trump administration has to say about removing DEI and removing the idea of reparations are, I think, in their heart, wanting to believe, well, this is a sense of total equity, of colorblindness. Everybody should be on equal footing. When it comes to reparations, many of those same people would say, I didn't have anything to do with slavery. As a historian, can you explain why reparations are important?
So there's a couple reasons. I mean, the first has to do with generational wealth. Historically, the barriers to being able to have a mortgage, for example, or to pass down generational wealth have been directly linked to formal and informal institutionalized barriers for African Americans and other groups, right? And so what reparations goal is to sort of stop this cycle and to begin to say, like, okay, we need to first acknowledge the fact that this system or practice has impeded people's equal rights. And then to begin to say, okay, now that we've acknowledged it, we are going to stop it and then move forward towards repair. So learning history, learning about past wrong is only a step. The next step is, okay, how do we undo these structures and barriers to that? And so I feel like we've made tremendous gains on some level, although in my city, regularly I learn more and more about the barriers for African Americans to live here, work here. I learn, as a person that studies history and studies local history, more and more about prominent people in Northampton whose wealth was derived from slavery. And if I'm a person who's that engaged and I'm like slowly bringing this to the surface into our community, we have to, as a community, come together and really think about, like, okay, let's really get into this. Let's identify and let's move towards repair.
In addition to generational wealth, community wealth, too, if you're looking at like later stages of this happening, it's why redlining is so important to include in the conversation, because communities of color were specifically broken apart for land development, for highway development, and the rebuilding that has to happen within the community, because like when you scatter, it gets harder to come back together, especially when you've already got these opinions about you that won't allow you to congregate in the same way that you were before.
And actually, just to build on that real quick, is just to say that, when people make the argument and conflate, the reparations movement as one that's focused on enslavement, that actually just isn't true. The reparations movement is about enslavement and then Jim Crow segregation that didn't just happen in the South.
Right.
Happened in the North as well. And then, of course, the policy and practices continued on, some would argue, are still here with us, and they will be still here if we don't acknowledge them and then create new pathways.
For instance, the Evanston one that you bring up, it has to do not with slavery specifically, but with sundown towns. Everything is constantly shifting the definition.
And sundown towns were towns where the black folks were said, you better get out of this town before sundown, or you're likely to be in trouble.
Yeah, and not just black people, like Jewish people, people of Chinese or Asian descent, people of Latin descent, like basically everybody who wasn't obviously considered white was not welcome in that town after sundown. Sometimes also not while the sun was up.
Right, and many of those towns exist in Massachusetts and here in the 413.
Absolutely.
Professor Ousmane Power-Greene, feel free to ignore this question, but you are somebody who is on the reparations committee in Northampton that's working on reparations right now. Any idea what those might look like from the city of Northampton at this point, or is it too early to really be kind of talking about what that might look like?
Yeah, so the commission that I'm on is the Northampton Reparations Study Commission, right? And so I just want to make sure people realize that I'm a part of the first process of studying and understanding historic wrongs and contemporary wrongs. We have published a preliminary report of ideas that we've come up with from talking to community members and also people's expertise on there. One concrete example of a possibility is that we call them racist or protective covenants on homes. These are on mortgages. Some people may not even be aware they're on there. Those cost money to remove, even though they've been, because of court case and decisions, somewhat invalidated. A repair that would fund removing them from homes, I think, would be a very, very important example of repair. And then,
a huge shout out to our friend ACLU attorney Bill Newman for doing a lot of work to investigate those mortgages that came from banks and different institutions in the city of Northampton.
Yeah, and he'll be doing a workshop on the work that he and others have done to identify them, because it takes labor to be able to even find them out. And so that's coming up. Point is that, our recommendations are posted and are available on the Northampton Reparations Study Commission website. These are preliminary ones, ideas we have for thinking about dealing with business ownership in the city and ways to sort of improve the possibility for black businesses and also the wealth gap and things. So I don't want to summarize them. If those are interested, go download the preliminary recommendations, and we're looking forward to having more finalized recommendations over the next month or so. It's a really important topic to understand and know about, and not to reflectively dismiss out of hand or reflectively applaud. You know what I mean? I think, just spending some time learning the history, I think, is really important. And there is a Massachusetts bill that did not pass last year, signed by Joe Comerford, and they will be, they worked on it, and they're going to bring it back again in Massachusetts. So the movement continues.
Professor Ousmane Power-Greene, you're a regular guest here month in and month out on the Fabulous 413, but we really appreciate you quadrupling your time with us for Black History Month. Thanks so much for taking so much time with us.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks.
Go celebrate Reparations Day in your own way by having a conversation, coming up with some solutions. We can't keep doing this.
Exactly.
And now the NEPM Newsroom's Karen Brown joins us to explore the Baystate's primary care shortage.
We'll hear about our new two-part series next. You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by the UMass 5 College Credit Union, offering co-op advantage checking with cash back on all purchases, plus secure debit card controls, all from the UMass 5 mobile banking app. Insured by NCUA, umass5.coop. The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by UMass Amherst School of Public Policy. Admissions now open for graduate programs in 2025. Learn how to become a changemaker at umass.edu/SPP.
Welcome back to the Fabulous 413. Almost every workforce survey in medicine right now shows a critical shortage of primary care doctors. In January, Massachusetts' Health Policy Commission called the doctor supply a, quote, state of extreme challenge, and data shows it's worse in Western Mass than in much of the state.
NEPM wanted to understand how a shortage in doctors is affecting the health of residents and why this longtime problem is only getting worse. NEPM's Karen Brown has a two-part series called The Infinite Waiting Room. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about your series.
Thank you for having me.
Especially because we all got stories about this.
Yeah, we all got stories. Betsy, our engineer, was saying that she has a story. I have a story. And
definitely
this
have stories.
will debut tomorrow on Morning Edition, and the part 2 will be the next day. This is something that I think people hear percolating in the background if they don't have their own personal story. What made you want to investigate this further for NEPM?
Well, I've been covering the primary care shortage for years. I did a documentary like 10 years ago thinking like that was the last one I needed to do on this.
Solve that problem.
Yeah. And I mean, personal stories, everybody I know can't get in to see either their own primary care doctor or they need a new primary care doctor. And this is, I'm a health reporter, and this is the backbone of our health system, or at least it's supposed to be. And we've had health reform, and that did not make it better in terms of being able to find doctors. So it's one of those stories that is always there, which makes it a little challenging for a reporter because it's not getting any better, and but it's still such a crisis that I just figured I want to at least keep it out there, and hopefully people will start coming up with solutions.
You, in the first segment that'll air tomorrow morning on Morning Edition, talk to a bunch of people with this struggle, and many of them end up having to go to the emergency room if they're having any medical issue whatsoever. What is the importance of a primary care physician? Why does there need to be – so my own personal story, during COVID, my doctor retired, and then I just didn't go to the doctor for like 2 years. They're like, well, you're without a doctor now. Why is that the first step for so many people when they need to find medical attention? That primary care physician?
I mean, it makes sense. That's the efficient way. You've got a gatekeeper who can, root out if you've got a serious problem or maybe not such a serious problem. So either they send you to a specialist or they say, wait a week and it'll go away. So it's, if we had enough primary care doctors, that would be the most efficient way to get health care. And the problem is that these gatekeepers there aren't enough of them. So you're stuck behind the gate, basically.
One of the things that comes out later is the use, starting to reuse nurse practitioners and physician's assistants for PCPs. And for years, I had a nurse practitioner as my PCP, and that is no longer the case because, again, they're hard to find. But talk about broadening and are there any actual? There aren't any actual differences in the care that they provide, right? Why is this now becoming an option that they're looking at?
Well, in many ways there are more. There's less training they have to go through. They are supervised by MDs, so to some degree, you can find more nurse practitioners and physician assistants. And I mean, there's some limit. There's some differences in what they can do, but scope of practice I think is fairly similar. But even they are harder to find, and there are also differences in how many patients they can take on. So that some people told me they can take on fewer patients than MDs, so that makes it harder to serve everybody that needs care.
We're speaking with NEPM reporter Karen Brown about her new two-part series that'll debut tomorrow morning, The Infinite Waiting Room. The part of the reason why there are so few available primary care physicians is economic, it seems, for the physicians themselves. You did a little investigation that won't necessarily make it into the two-part series about what medical schools are doing to try to encourage more people who are studying medicine to get into the world of primary care. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated phenomenon, and it's not that primary care doctors are being paid as little as public radio reporters, for instance. They have a decent salary, but compared to specialists like dermatologists or cardiologists, they are paid much, much less, and they have huge loans. So there's a lot of economic reasons why they may not go into it. But there are other reasons that I was told that a lot of med students don't go the primary care route, and that's because it doesn't feel as interesting or doesn't feel as exciting, or they don't feel as much of a pull. So a lot of medical schools are thinking, how do we change that? How do we make primary care more interesting? So Harvard, for instance, recently started more of an in-depth route so that students will get like a mentor from a primary care doctor, or they'll get to know patients over time so that they can really get the benefit of being they can understand the benefit, which is that you really get to know your patients. You really get to go through the entire lifetime of some patients, things that are really satisfying aspects of primary care that are not as obvious when you're in med school and you're just seeing cardiologists maybe, save somebody's life, whereas primary care is a little bit more mundane. So how do you make it seem less mundane? Then there are other more direct ways of giving people maybe promising bonuses if you promise to go into primary care for 2 years. So maybe giving some kind of economic incentive to at least start your career that way. I mean, they're just trying as many types of incentives as they can to get students to choose this track that should be really important, but somehow just doesn't grab as many students.
Part 2 of your series, which will air on Wednesday, kind of talks about concierge medicine, which is something that is fascinating, maybe a more economic boon for people who want to do the primary care thing but make more money. Can you talk about even the rise of concierge medicine here in the 413?
Yeah, well, so concierge, and there's another type of care called direct care, is basically when you charge a membership fee in addition to whatever you're paying for your insurance premium. So this is going to cost maybe anywhere between $1,000 and $50,000 a year. Now, in the Pioneer Valley, it's more like $1,000 to maybe $4,000. But this is money that you're paying on top of your copays, on top of your insurance premiums. But a lot of doctors are saying this is how they can keep their practices small. This is how they can get you in so you don't have to wait 14 months for your annual physical, which makes no sense math-wise. And it's a way for them to be able to practice the medicine that they were trained for. But it excludes people who can't afford the membership fee. And it also makes it harder to find a doctor because if someone's going from, say, 2,000 patients to 200, that leaves everybody else out in the cold.
Right. So even if they have space, it doesn't necessarily matter if they have space if their patients can't afford to be there. It reminds me, there is some sort of connection here between, this model for doctors and the movement to arts nonprofits. I see parallels.
Yeah, that may be. I mean, I go to the community health center, which is kind of like a clinic, and I have a primary care on paper, but I often see the nurse practitioner or whatever, and maybe there's a new model. Maybe 10 years from now, we'll have figured out this model for the next incarnation of this.
Will we?
Yeah.
Yes. Well,
we?
It's a fascinating piece, and you will hear the part 1 of it tomorrow on Morning Edition, then again on All Things Considered, I believe, if you miss it in the morning. And then part 2, which talks more about the concierge medicine concept the next day. It's fascinating. There's stuff about the use of AI and how that may factor into primary care in the future. It's Karen Brown's new 2-part series, The Infinite Waiting Room. It was irresistible not to use Fugazi as the background music for this. Thanks so much, Karen.
Thank you.
As opposed to 07, we could have used In the Waiting Line.
I love that one, but that's waiting line, not waiting room.
Oh,
the next Fabulous
fine.
413 is one of those shows about the nostalgic side of our community.
Where we dig into Northampton's past with the new documentary Lesbians of Color, with the team bringing their stories on screen, Erica Slocum and Michael Hansen.
And speaking of screens, we'll revisit older media that still resonates with us and the community with the team behind the upcoming nonprofit Vision Video, bringing brick-and-mortar video stores back to life in Northampton.
Someone in our operating room is really excited
Already
about
volunteered.
that. Already volunteered. And in the sports that bring us up on our wheels, we talk with Pioneer Valley Roller Derby about their upcoming recruitment seasons. I'm Khaleesi Smith.
I'm Monty Belmonte. We'll
Talk
see you tomorrow.